Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
While my husband was overseas, wearing a uniform that carried the weight of this entire nation on his back, I was at home trying to convince myself that I could hold the family together until he came back. People always talk about patriotism like it is a banner you wave at a parade, but when you are the one left behind, patriotism feels more like long nights where the walls echo with silence and mornings when you wake up alone in a bed that suddenly feels too big. I told myself I was strong, that I could manage the mortgage, the bills, the endless family obligations that seemed to double once he deployed. I tried to believe that this was my battle while he was fighting his. I just didn't know the real enemy was already inside my house. It started with the phone calls. At first, they sounded innocent enough. My husband's younger brother, Daniel, would call in the evenings to check in and make sure I wasn't struggling with groceries or fixing the dripping sink. His tone was casual, even helpful, and at the beginning, I felt relief that at least someone from the family was willing to stand beside me while I navigated the chaos of solo life. But there was something in his voice that lingered a bit too long, a little too warm, and though I brushed it off, my stomach knotted each time I hung up. When he showed up one Saturday with a toolbox, insisting on fixing the garage door, I told myself it was family duty, nothing more. Yet I caught the way his eyes drifted over me like he was studying a painting, not visiting a sister-in-law. Daniel had always been the charming one, the golden boy who never had to fight for attention because it seemed to fall into his lap. My husband was steady, responsible, the kind of man who built his worth on discipline and loyalty. Daniel, on the other hand, leaned on his smile and the easy excuses of being the youngest. At family gatherings, I had noticed the difference, but never cared much. I wasn't marrying the golden boy, I was marrying the soldier. What unsettled me was how quickly that difference began to feel like a threat when I was left on my own. The turning point came one late night when I received a message from him, a simple line that should not have meant anything. You shouldn't have to be alone all the time. I stared at the screen, reading it again and again, the words sliding between comfort and insinuation. I typed back, "I'm fine, really," and set the phone down, but the air in the room felt heavier than it had before. The next day, he dropped by with takeout, saying I shouldn't bother cooking after a long workday. I remember the way he leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me unpack the containers, smiling in a way that was just a shade too intimate. I laughed it off, made excuses, even told myself I was imagining it. After all, wasn't I supposed to be grateful? His parents certainly thought so. They called frequently, reminding me how lucky I was to have Daniel nearby, how family looks out for each other, how it's not easy being a military wife, but at least you've got him. Each word boxed me into a corner where saying no, creating distance, or even voicing discomfort would make me sound ungrateful, paranoid, or worse, disloyal. I swallowed my unease, telling myself that when my husband came home, none of this would matter. But things escalated, and quickly. Daniel started showing up uninvited, lingering too long, offering to help with things I had never asked for. When I pushed back, he played hurt, acting like I had slapped away an innocent gesture. He had a way of twisting the situation so that I ended up apologizing, even when I knew I had every right to draw a line. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, I walked into the living room to find him sitting on my couch with a beer in hand, waiting for me as though it were his own home. He said, almost casually, "You shouldn't have to do this alone. You deserve more than waiting around." Those words hit me like a stone to the chest. There was no mistaking the intention anymore. He wasn't offering help, he was circling me like a vulture waiting for weakness. For a second, I froze, my heart pounding, my mind racing through excuses and exits, but I forced myself to laugh it off, telling him I was tired and needed to sleep. He left that night, but not without letting his hand linger on the back of the couch as he walked past me, like a mark he wanted me to notice. I told myself then and there that I would tell my husband everything, that I would rip this open before it turned into something uglier. But when I sat down with the phone in my hand, ready to call him overseas, I hesitated. He was already burdened with danger, already carrying the weight of life and death decisions every single day. Did I really want to add this poison to his plate? Would he even believe me without proof? Would he think I was exaggerating? That night, I put the phone down and decided to wait, to gather evidence, to make sure I had something undeniable before dragging him into it. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting us. What I didn't realize was that my silence was the first step toward losing everything. And years later, when people ask me where the betrayal began, I don't say it started with Daniel's words or his parents' blind defense. I say it started the moment I chose not to tell my husband the truth. That mistake burned deeper than anything else, because I knew even then, in the pit of my stomach, that it would cost me far more than I could imagine. The morning his mother called to remind me that family is everything, I was standing in the kitchen staring at a coffee mug I did not remember pouring, trying to decide whether I had slept at all or just laid there with my eyes shut while the house hummed and the refrigerator clicked and the neighborhood sprinklers hissed in rotation like a slow-motion applause. And when she slipped in the line about how grateful I must be to have Daniel, stepping up like a real man, I felt something tilt. Inside me, not a dramatic snap, but the kind of quiet shift you only notice when a picture frame has gone crooked, and every time you pass it you feel the urge to fix it even though you did not bump the wall. They began coming over more often under the banner of concern that sounded generous and felt like surveillance, dropping off casseroles that tasted of obligation, asking small questions that were not small at all. Was I eating? Was I sleeping? Was I getting out enough? Did Daniel have a key? Because it would be so much safer if he did, and before I knew it the conversation had migrated from, "How are you holding up?" to "Let him help. It makes him feel useful," a sentence that landed like an assignment written on my forehead in invisible ink that only they could read. I learned quickly that any resistance was framed as ingratitude, and any mention of boundaries was translated into offense. His mother would purse her lips and murmur that she knew what stress could do to a woman's judgment, while his father would clear his throat in that diplomatic way that suggests you are the unreasonable one for noticing a problem everyone else has decided not to see. Daniel, suddenly emboldened by this chorus of approval, refined his visits into a performance of competence that looked wonderful in the abstract and bled into my space in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. Arriving with grocery bags I had not requested, letting himself in when I was in the shower so the house echoed with his voice calling my name from the hallway, texting late at night with lines that tiptoed to the edge of acceptable and then winked as they leaned over it, telling me that I deserved company, that my strength was beautiful, that waiting did not have to mean empty. I tried the polite refusals and the strategic delays and the white lies about meetings or errands, but each deflection only fed the narrative that I was fragile and he was steady. And I realized that pushing him back in daylight would only invite a family tribunal where the verdict was already written. So I did something that felt like betrayal and self-defense at the same time. I turned my phone into a quiet witness. I set the voice memo to roll when I knew he would drop by, buried it under the folded dish towels, and learned to ask questions that sounded harmless while he talked himself into the kind of sentences men only say when they think the room belongs to them. I kept every text, even the ones that were almost nothing, because I knew the almost was the point, and I forwarded the thread to a private email I had created the night before, a blank inbox with a ridiculous name that would never show up on our shared accounts. I told myself that evidence was not revenge, that I was simply buying myself a future where my husband would not have to choose between believing me and believing his brother. But even as I thought it, I understood that some truths only sink in when they carry a sting, and that I needed Daniel to feel something he could not explain away. When he offered to replace the weather stripping on the back door and save me a service call, I said yes with a sweetness I did not feel, and while he worked I asked whether he was still seeing Lauren, the on-again off-again girlfriend who knew his inventory of charm and excuses better than any of us. He rolled his eyes and said Lauren was too dramatic, and then, because men like Daniel always compete with themselves, he added that some women only learn to appreciate attention when they had gone without it, a statement that sounded like philosophy and landed like graffiti. That night, sitting at the dining table with the recording open and the house finally quiet, I clipped the section where his voice slid from helpful to hungry, saved it as a file named with a date and nothing more, and sent it from a newly minted anonymous account to Lauren with 2 lines that were not angry and not kind, only precise. You do not know me, you do not have to respond, but you deserve to hear the way he speaks when he thinks no one will remember. The fallout did not announce itself like thunder. It arrived in fragments, beginning with Daniel's silence, then a brief message from his mother asking whether I had said something to upset him, followed by the sight of him 2 days later standing at the edge of my porch with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a tone that said he could not decide whether to plead or accuse. He asked whether I had talked to Lauren because someone poisoned the well, and I tilted my head and asked why a private man felt so threatened by a private woman's choices, and told him softly, so he would lean in to hear it, that I had begun keeping a diary of everything we said to each other, not because I wanted to, but because memory is a slippery thing and I did not want either of us to misunderstand ourselves later. He laughed too loudly and told me I was being dramatic, then left with the kind of controlled exit that suggests a conference call is about to be convened without you. By Sunday, the call arrived, not from him but from his parents, who asked me to come for dinner because families address issues at the table, a sentence loaded like a suitcase with all the unspoken rules I was supposed to carry without complaining. I went because retreat is its own confession in households like theirs, and because I wanted to see whether the ground under their certainty would hold if I tapped it. When I walked in, the table was set, the roast was carved, the good china was out, and in the center, propped against a water pitcher, a tablet sat upright with my husband's face frozen mid-blink, waiting for the connection to resume. Which it did as I took my seat, and he looked at me with that soldier's calm that both freezes and warms you, and said my name in a voice that made the room fall silent. I slid my phone across the table and said I had something he needed to see before anyone started the speeches, opened the thread to the messages Daniel thought would always live in the soft focus of plausible deniability, and handed it to my husband as the video caught up and his eyes tracked every word, every timestamp, every little heart reaction his brother had sent himself like applause. He did not look at me first. He lifted his gaze and found Daniel standing in the doorway, invited late and arriving early, and the room drew one long breath that sounded exactly like a fuse being lit. When my husband finally stepped off the plane, dragging a uniform that had seen more danger than most people could imagine, I thought I would feel relief in his arms, the kind of relief that heals months of distance, tension, and sleepless nights. But instead I felt the weight of the past months pressing down, a presence that had grown larger than his absence, and I realized almost immediately that the air between us had shifted in ways I could not have anticipated. The airport was crowded with returning soldiers and families, the noise and the announcements and the echoing footsteps blending into a chaotic soundtrack that made it feel like the world had moved forward without permission, and as I walked toward him with the small, hopeful smile I had practiced in the mirror for days, I noticed the tightness in his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes when they swept past me to the side, where Daniel lingered with a look that suggested he had claimed a small victory I had not yet fully understood. The first conversation in the car on the way home was measured, careful, as if we were both testing whether words could survive the distance between us, and I tried to speak casually, to tell him about the little things he had missed, the bills that had arrived, the neighbor who had repaired her fence, the mail that needed attention, but every sentence felt like it was bouncing off an invisible wall, landing somewhere outside of him, and I caught his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The slight flinch when he saw a familiar street that no longer felt familiar, and in that moment I realized that nothing about coming home was simple, not even the relief of seeing him alive and whole. The tension escalated when we arrived at the house, where the normality I had tried to preserve seemed to crumble under his quiet observation. He walked through the rooms with his hands behind his back, touching nothing, observing everything. And I could feel him counting the hours I had been alone, measuring the intrusion of Daniel's presence, sensing the small shifts I had made in his absence, the curtains I had drawn differently, the furniture slightly rearranged, and most importantly, the whispers of betrayal I had tried to contain until the right moment. I watched him pause in the kitchen, eyes narrowing slightly at the tablet I had left charging on the counter, the one that contained the recordings, the messages, and the evidence I had painstakingly collected over weeks. And I understood that his mind was already calculating what I had not yet voiced aloud. It was during dinner, the first proper meal since his return, that the confrontation began in the quietest possible way, subtle and sharp, like a knife sliding into a seam unnoticed until the blood appears. Daniel made a joke about how I had survived so long without him, and I felt the smile freeze on my husband's face, his fork clattering against the plate with a sound that was small but heavy, echoing in my chest as he looked from Daniel to me, and I saw the recognition in his eyes, the slow dawning that something had shifted while he was away, that someone he trusted had crossed lines that could not be unseen. I spoke then, carefully, deliberately, not yelling, not begging, simply narrating the sequence of events, the messages, the visits, the subtle invasions, the manipulation that had been normalized by his parents and facilitated by Daniel's charm. Each word precise, measured, and undeniable, and I watched my husband's face as comprehension dawned, the muscles in his jaw flexing, the tension in his shoulders rising, and for the first time I felt that the scale had tipped, that the truth was no longer something that could be ignored or rationalized, that the betrayal could no longer be softened by family loyalty or excuses of concern. The room changed in the moments that followed, thick with unspoken decisions, judgment, and the kind of shock that reshapes alliances without a word, and I realized that his parents, who had pressed me to let it go for family, were suddenly on the defensive. Their certainty faltering as evidence replaced assumptions, and Daniel, who had strutted through months of subtle dominance, now looked smaller, unsure, the first cracks appearing in a facade he had built on my silence and their approval. My husband did not speak at first, not because he lacked words, but because he was calculating, weighing how to confront, how to protect, how to punish. And I understood that the revenge I had delayed until this moment had already taken root simply by bringing the truth into the room and letting it live there, undeniable and sharp, like a shard of glass reflecting every flaw in the carefully curated narrative of family unity. By the end of the evening, no one was untouched. His parents exchanged glances that suggested the first seeds of doubt. Daniel sat quietly with a forced composure that made it impossible to predict whether he would strike back or retreat, and my husband, finally turning his gaze toward me, said nothing but pressed his hand over mine in a gesture that was complicated, conflicted, and quiet, a mixture of relief, anger, and the recognition that our relationship, though scarred, had endured the first wave of betrayal, and that the next moves would be determined not by words alone but by the cleverness, patience, and precision with which we navigated the storms that were now impossible to avoid. The days following that first tense dinner did not bring the relief I had expected, and instead of easing, the pressure only multiplied as his parents became more insistent, offering words framed as concern but laced with expectation, urging me to let it go for the family, as if forgiveness were a simple act of goodwill rather than a confrontation with betrayal that had reshaped the foundation of our home, and I found myself walking through each morning with the weight of their assumptions pressing against my chest, the quiet judgment in their voices heavier than any physical burden I had carried while my husband served overseas, knowing that the decisions I made now would determine not only the atmosphere of our house, but also the trajectory of relationships that had once seemed untouchable. Daniel, emboldened by the ambiguity of the situation, moved through the house with a confidence that had never belonged to him, his charm now sharpened by the understanding that silence had protected him until this point. And I watched him in every interaction, noting the subtle ways he sought proximity, the half-smiles that lingered too long, the excuses that masked intention as he offered to handle errands or fix things I never asked him to touch. And I realized that confronting him directly would not suffice because he had learned to navigate both my politeness and my husband's conflicted loyalty with a skill that made simple arguments meaningless, requiring instead a strategy that was both precise and inescapable. I began documenting everything more rigorously, every word, every gesture, every moment when Daniel overstepped boundaries in ways that could no longer be attributed to friendliness, and while I did so, I devised a subtle yet effective method of undermining his control, not with confrontation, but through exposure that was quiet, surgical, and impossible to dispute. I coordinated conversations where mutual acquaintances would witness his manipulations firsthand, arranged social situations where his intentions became obvious without the need for accusation, and crafted interactions in which the weight of evidence fell naturally into place, allowing those around him, including our closest family, to observe the truth without my having to overtly declare it. My husband, still navigating the emotional aftermath of returning home, seemed caught in a liminal space between disbelief and anger, torn by the instinct to protect his family, the shock of betrayal, and the sense that the world he had left was no longer the one he returned to, and I watched him carefully, aware that any rash action on my part could fracture the fragile thread of trust that remained. Understanding that the most effective revenge would be invisible to him at first, leaving him to grapple with the implications while Daniel faced consequences that were unavoidable, elegantly crafted through the architecture of social exposure rather than overt confrontation. The most delicate moments came during family gatherings orchestrated by his parents, designed to normalize Daniel's presence and implicitly shame my resistance, where I was expected to smile and engage, to absorb polite commentary about keeping the family united while silently enduring subtle insinuations that I was overreacting, and during these events, I began to deploy my strategy, weaving in casual observations, questions that prompted reflection, and anecdotes that highlighted inconsistencies without accusation, creating a web of awareness that left Daniel increasingly exposed, his charm faltering as others began to notice the dissonance between his words and actions, and I realized that each small, intentional act of exposure accumulated in a way that made avoidance impossible. I found a particularly effective moment during a weekend gathering when a neighbor who had witnessed Daniel's overreach in the garden commented casually on his apparent familiarity with my routines, noting the times he had entered spaces without invitation. And I observed the subtle shift in his demeanor, the tension that replaced his usual smirk, as he realized that the facade he had maintained for months was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of objective witnesses, and in that moment, I felt the first rush of vindication, the quiet satisfaction that comes not from overt triumph, but from the knowledge that the truth had begun to move through the channels it could not be stopped in, leaving him to navigate consequences of his own making. Even as his parents pressed, insisting that family loyalty required silence, I maintained my composure, allowing my husband to witness the unfolding of the situation without interference, guiding the events subtly so that each revelation landed with clarity and force, and I understood that my role had shifted from defender to orchestrator, not seeking vengeance through anger, but through a methodical, intelligent application of truth, forcing Daniel to confront the implications of his actions. While the rest of the family could no longer ignore what had been meticulously documented, and I knew that the final reckoning would come not with words alone, but with the undeniable consequences of months of careful observation and subtle exposure. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the house had shifted irreversibly. Daniel's confidence had eroded, the parents' insistence had softened as inconsistencies became impossible to ignore, and my husband, though still cautious, began to see the contours of reality in a way that allowed him to reassess loyalties, recalibrate trust, and witness the effectiveness of a quiet but relentless strategy, leaving me in a position of both control and moral clarity. The stage set for the final confrontation that would determine not only the immediate outcomes of betrayal, but the long-term balance of power and integrity within a family that had been fractured by secrecy, deceit, and the complex interplay of love, loyalty, and revenge. The morning light fell in a diffuse glow across my porch, catching the edges of the ledger I had placed carefully in front of my mother the day before. The pages now slightly curled from the moisture of her tears and the tremor of her hands as she had clutched them like talismans of guilt and recognition, and I watched her sit there in the lingering silence. The kind of silence that stretches long enough for both reflection and regret to settle into the corners of a room, knowing that the years of neglect, the ignored birthdays, the small and consistent erasures of my presence, had accumulated into a force that could not be erased with words, with pleas, or even with the meticulously practiced gestures of maternal remorse that she now offered in their rawest form, and I understood fully that this was the culmination of a reckoning I had orchestrated carefully, patiently, and deliberately over months, shaping the narrative with every blocked call, every ignored message, every small, quiet act of boundary setting that had slowly shifted the power in the relationship from them to me. She attempted to speak, her voice trembling not just from residual emotion but from the dawning comprehension that the ledger did not simply catalog numbers and dates, but told a story of invisibility, of contributions made without acknowledgement, of countless hours and moments that had been rendered invisible by the selective attention of a family that had consistently prioritized my sister, and I allowed her the space to find her footing, watching the arc of recognition cross her features. The way understanding and discomfort mingled in a dance that was both fascinating and satisfying, because finally the weight of her past inaction, of favoritism, and of dismissal was something she could feel. Something that pressed upon her chest in a tangible way that mirrored the pressure I had carried quietly for years. She began a halting narrative, attempting to explain, to soften, to reconcile, weaving phrases of apology with qualifiers and justifications, as if by layering words she could somehow dilute the substance of her neglect, and I listened intently, measuring the sincerity of each statement against the ledger's quiet testimony, the irrefutable record of years spent proving my worth through action rather than receiving recognition, and while the tears on her cheeks were real, I recognized that emotions alone could not restore the balance, could not account for the void left by consistent invisibility, and could not erase the pattern of preference that had defined my family dynamic for as long as I could remember. When she paused, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was facing, I reached for the envelope I had prepared, an envelope that contained more than just words, more than just a tally of financial contributions and labor and loyalty. It contained the essence of accountability, distilled into a form that she could not argue with or evade, and I handed it to her with deliberate calm, observing the flicker of understanding and fear as she realized that this simple act, passing a sealed document across a threshold that remained firmly closed, was both a message and a boundary, a form of justice that required her to reckon with the full measure of her actions without any immediate opportunity to deflect, apologize superficially, or appeal to sentimentality. Her hands shook as she took the envelope, and I could see in her eyes the collision of disbelief and dawning comprehension, the slow recognition that the control she had assumed, the influence she had wielded over our family dynamics, and the unexamined assumptions of compliance I had allowed her to take for granted had all been quietly dismantled by a single, deliberate decision to assert my autonomy, to demand recognition through documentation rather than supplication, and to create a space in which she could confront the tangible consequences of years of selective affection and attention, a space in which her presence alone would not suffice to erase the years of erasure she had imposed. I did not open the door, did not offer comfort, did not speak further, because the lesson was now in her hands, literally and figuratively, and I knew that the envelope carried the weight of truth far beyond what words alone could convey. Because it represented both the reclamation of my voice and the assertion of my boundaries, a calculated act of closure that was simultaneously a declaration and a challenge, forcing her to engage with the consequences of neglect in a form that could not be ignored, rationalized away, or softened by tears or pleas. As I stepped back into the shadowed interior of my home, leaving her clutching the envelope on the porch, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that justice need not be loud or dramatic to be effective, that careful, deliberate, and meaningful action can speak louder than apologies, and that the restoration of one's agency, after years of invisibility and dismissal, is the most powerful form of revenge, capable of resonating long after the immediate moment has passed, leaving in its wake a profound clarity, a recognition that boundaries have been established and that they will not be compromised, and in that silence, as I closed the door behind me, I understood fully that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a relationship measured on terms I alone would define, a relationship in which my voice, my contributions, and my presence would never again be taken for granted, and the uncertainty that lingered on the porch, where the envelope rested, was proof that the lesson had been received, yet the resolution remained entirely in my control.